All right, hey everyone. I want to close out our look at this period of imperialism and colonialism from 1750 to 1900 by bringing in a brief discussion of what was going on in East Asia and Japan in particular. Hopefully, you did your readings on Monday and have a little bit of context and background for what I'll be talking about here. And I want to look at this through some of these really fascinating Japanese woodblock prints. Um, really quite remarkable little pieces of art that can tell us quite a bit about what's happening in 19th century Japan as they go through this very dramatic transition. Right? So, if you remember last time we talked about Japan um, from 1450 to 1750, we looked at some of the contacts they were having with the West. In Portugal, in particular, we saw them with this trade connection with Portugal, as Portugal kind of became the middleman between China and Japanese trade. Um, that didn't go so well for the Portuguese, if you remember. The Portuguese weren't satisfied with just engaging in economic activity. They were interested in cultural activity too, and in particular, spreading the Catholic faith into Japan, um, which ends up getting them kicked out, and several Catholic priests are killed in the process. Japan will outlaw Christianity for quite a while after that. This kind of sours Japan's image of the West, right? And they put some restrictions in place to kind of control who's coming in and influencing the country. Uh, and essentially, what we see is the Dutch are still allowed to trade with Japan, right? Set up on this island, and it's you know very much just focused on economic activity, right? Um, Now, that's all going to change here in the 19th century. We're going to see Japan go through a very dramatic transformation um, in reaction to global events. Right? We have this context we need to think about as the world system is changing and becoming more and more influenced by Europe um, and the growing United States as well. We see the expansion of imperialism. Right? We looked at Africa last week um, and how the colonial powers from Europe treated the peoples of Africa. We looked at India. We saw the British Empire really expand into India and end up taking most of the subcontinent. So, what we'll see here is Japan is going to start engaging in these activities as well. Okay? So, I want to start with a very interesting image from a Western publication called Puck, kind of a political satire magazine in a sense. But this is a really interesting image here. Here you have, um, all these women who represent mostly Western nations, but here you have Japan, right? The title says Japan makes her debut. Right? She's stepping up onto the stage here, right? The global stage. This represents Britain being the kind of center of global empire, right? Welcoming her into the kind of family of imperial nations, right? France, right? Um, Here you've got China in the back, right, watching all of this happen. Remember, China's undergone some major transitions themselves due to the Opium Wars with Britain and France, and then after that, um, quite a bit of turmoil. And if you don't remember what happened there, make sure you go back and read Robert Marks on that. He does a really good job of covering what they call in China the Century of Humiliation. Okay? Um, so I think this does a really good job of kind of showing um, how Japan is seen by the rest of the world, right? Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, um, referred to the Japanese as the white Asians, right? So it's a very interesting kind of global context to look at this in. Right? And let's look at a quote talking about the emergence of Imperial Japan. Right? So just take a second to read through this. If you need to pause it, it's fine. There's a couple of key lines in here, right? Um, and essentially what we see happening is, Japan sees this Western imperial model, right? They see what has happened to China, they see what has happened to India, and there's this kind of if you can't beat them, join them attitude, right? So they're going to very deliberately industrialize, as well as change their governmental system to becoming more centralized rather than a decentralized feudal system. Okay? Um, and really try to model themselves on these Western powers who are um, colonizing and kind of wreaking havoc around the world and really altering the way the world system functions. Okay? So to look at some of these woodblock prints, okay? This is the Emperor of Japan, okay? And what you notice here is the emperor and his family are dressed in Western clothing, right? Um, again, the Westernization process is kind of totalizing here in terms of government and industry. Okay? It's a very interesting print. Right, it gives you kind of an idea of these cultural shifts that are happening in Japan, right, as they imitate this Western model. Here you see the emperor with his government and ministers. Again, thing to notice here, very westernized, right? They're all in these Western style clothing. Okay? And what we'll see is Japan will move from, being this kind of decentralized feudal state that we saw previously to a constitutional monarchy, right, with the emperor as the head of state, and then these elected representatives from the different regions of Japan, um, kind of modeled on the British model, right? Very European style model of governance that they're putting in place here. It's called the Diet, okay? Diet. And this new government will direct this industrialization of Japan, right? They will kind of steer the Japanese economy towards um, an industrial outlook, right? Now, what we should note about Japan is there are some similarities with Britain, right? They're both these kind of smaller island nations, and they have certain resources. But if you're going to be an industrial power and mass produce goods on a global scale for global consumption, um, you don't have everything you need, right? Britain had coal, they had a couple of other things, but as we've seen, just like other European nations as well, they're going to have to venture out into the rest of the world to get these resources for their industry. And that's where colonialism and imperialism come in. Japan will be in a similar circumstance, right? Think about the geography, think about the resources they have available there. Um, and they're going to start viewing Asia and even beyond, as territory for Japanese colonization, so they can have access to these resources. And you'll see some of the same ideas and attitudes that Westerners have about, what we call like the other, right? Where you see this kind of delineation between um, the British and people in Africa or South Asia or Australian Aborigines or what have you, right? We'll see the same thing with Japan, where there's this kind of social Darwinist idea um, that the Japanese are better than these other Asian nations, okay? And these other nations should look up to them as a model for what they should be doing. Okay? So it's a very colonialist, imperialist kind of Western model, right, that they're going to take on here. And again, they're going to direct this industrialization, right? Kind of centrally planned in a sense. Okay. In this one, we see the arrival of the steam powered train, right? Powered off of coal. Okay. Um, Again, revolutionary technology all around the world, right? We see this in uh, Europe, as well as the colonial regions too, as the colonizers bring in this technology so they can move materials from the interior of these colonies out into the coastal region, so you can move these resources around the world. right? So we'll see again Japan starting with railroads in Japan, and we'll see that expanded in other places in Asia as they colonize, like Korea, parts of China. Right? Steam powered ships as well, right? Very crucial to an industrial empire. Again, you need to move your people, you need to move these resources, these finished goods around, right? Um, Interestingly, there's going to see a shift in the kind of socioeconomic patterns as well. You know, you think about the feudal period where you have samurai and this whole um, what we view today as kind of an antiquated, social structure. So what's going to happen to people like samurai? Well, a lot of them will become businessmen. Okay? Some of them will be sent overseas to Europe and the United States to learn how to develop these industries. Okay? And we'll see the samurai as we traditionally knew it fading away and becoming this new kind of business class in Japan. Okay? Um, as far as women go, women are kind of the backbone of this new industrial economy. You know, they are the textile workers in Japan. You see it in the woodblock prints. Okay? Um, a lot of these women are coming from rural households. They're coming to the cities to work, and much of the income that they earn gets sent back to their families. Right, something that happens today still. Okay? Not in Japan necessarily, but in other parts of the world, right? We see that with migration to the US, for example, right? People from Latin America will migrate to the United States, send money back to the home country, right? Back to their family. So it's a very kind of similar situation here. Um, Again, this doesn't function without these female workers, right? Um, so it's kind of an interesting new social structure that's developing where you have these male samurai and kind of more uh, higher on the social hierarchy, becoming the management and the owners of these new businesses, right? With a female workforce. Okay? And you can see it in a couple more of these prints. This is silk production, right? You can see the cocoons here. Basket of them here. And then again, seamstresses, right? Producing textiles. And notice they're dressed in Western clothing here, right? Now, one more aspect that we want to think about is as Japan becomes a global empire, what role does industry play in that, right? This new industrialization. Well, just like in the West, warfare will become industrialized as well with these steam powered ships and this new weapons technology that will enable them to conquer large parts of Asia, right? And in the reading from Monday, again, they go over some of this imperialism as well, right? Where we see Japan taking over Korea, um, fighting against China, as well as fighting against Russia. Okay? Um, this is the print that shows them fighting the Russian soldiers, okay, in the region of Manchuria, okay, in far eastern Russia. Okay? Um, Interesting episode in history. The Western powers did not think Japan was going to win this war um, because Russia was a Western nation, right? So the assumption was, well, an Eastern power cannot defeat a Western power. However, that's not what happened, right? Japan wins, and this really um, kind of changes the perception that the Western powers have of Japan as this emerging new um, nation to be dealt with on a global scale. Okay? And that's where again you see people like Theodore Roosevelt calling them the white Asians, right? Trying to cultivate a relationship with Japan. Okay? Well, at the same time, being worried about Japan, right, and the west coast of the United States, right, as Japan keeps expanding and expanding. Okay? And that obviously will come to fruition, right, during World War II with the conflict between Japan and the United States, right? So this process that starts in the late 1800s, will continue up until World War II, right? As Japan becomes this truly, truly global empire by this point. Um, and we'll come back to and look at Japan post World War II as well, right? We'll look at some of the changes that are going to be brought to Japan after the war, right? They're going to lose that empire that they had created, um, and kind of come under the control of the United States for a number of years as we write them a new constitution, etc. And we claim some of that territory that they had under their control. Some of those Pacific islands, will end up taking those from Japan and holding on to them to this day, right? Their territories. Okay? Now, the reading, or I'm sorry, before we get to that last part, just to refresh and review what we went through, right? Big changes. Okay. So if you're thinking about the state and the government, you go from feudalism, right? This decentralized system, right? Where you have these feudal lords in control of certain parts of Japan, um, to a constitutional monarchy, right? Where the nation is brought together as a whole, right? And you start to have this very nationalistic and imperialistic outlook, okay? Um, the state will have a role in industrializing the economy, kind of directing the new approach that they're going to take, right? So again, we see steam power to run these factories, to run transportation like trains and ships. And then don't forget the gendered nature of this, right? Where you have the women being the kind of industrial workforce here, okay? And then finally, the industrialization of war itself, right? Which allows for Japan to become this global imperial power, right? Fight wars with Korea, Russia, China. And again, that goes up until World War II, right? When they're defeated um, by the United States dropping 2 atomic bombs on them, right? Something, again, that we will come back to in the future. Okay. Now, the reading from yesterday, if you haven't done that yet, go back and here's what I want you to think about. And I'm going to go back in and put this on the website. I think I forgot to put the questions on there, so I apologize for that. So what you want to think about is this Japanese occupation of Korea, right? What are the cultural effects? Because what you're going to see is, again, this kind of social Darwinist attitude towards the Koreans, where Japanese culture is superior to Korean culture, right? And they're going to try to impose some of these Japanese standards on them. Okay? What are the social effects, right? What does this mean for social hierarchies in Korea? Okay? What does it mean for women in Korea? Okay? We're going to see some environmental effects here too, as Korea becomes kind of a peripheral economic zone for Japanese industry. Okay? Um, and Blakemore does a good job of looking at resistance to Japanese occupation too, which is always an important thing to think about, right? How do people resist colonialism, imperialism, and these kind of authoritarian regimes that are trying to impose new economic, political, social structures on these colonized people? Okay, and then what does this mean for the history of relations between Korea and Japan? Right, to this day, Korea doesn't. There's a lot of skepticism of Japan, right? So in South Korea, North Korea too, um, where the Koreans feel like Japan has not fully atoned for what happened here. Okay, um, and you can see this in mass culture in South Korea, in movies and television, etc. Okay? And I'm going to put a link to a short video that kind of covers some of these movies that have come out recently that focus on the Japanese occupation of Korea. It's a news piece from Korean media. It's really quite fascinating. So I'll put a link to that too on the website for you. Okay. And like I said, I'll put these questions on there too. Okay. All right. So that's it for Japan, East Asia, looking at the changes there. Okay. All right. So I'll talk to you all later.